Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Placius chapter 6, called Food and Technology. In this chapter, Placius is asking us to think carefully about how exactly technology should be understood insofar as it's shaping what exactly it is that we are eating, right? So it's not simply a question of things like convenience or how efficient the food industry might be, but instead we're actually thinking about the morality of the way in which the food is produced. It's especially an important topic as it combines questions about environmental ethics, agriculture, as well as social justice. Uh, and then we're also going to think about this question of to what extent the food we eat is to be understood as natural. How exactly are we to understand this claim that some food is natural while maybe other food that we eat is not? Right. So food technology might seem like a very practical or kind of scientific topic. Placius aims at showing that it's deeply philosophical, right? So Placius is asking us to consider what kind of relationship we have with nature itself, with the agricultural system, and with one another. To what extent are these systems important in sustaining the very lives that we have, and indeed the economy that we have? And like Placius says at the beginning of the chapter, and I want to emphasize here, when we're using the term GM, this generally means genetically modified. And when we're using the term GMO, this refers to genetically modified organisms. And there is dispute about to what extent these terms are helpful. I think maybe using a term like genetically engineered is maybe a better a way of understanding what we're talking about here as it relates to food and technology and how we're producing the food that we're eating. And that's because really we've been genetically modifying our foods for pretty much ever, right? We're certainly not eating the original bananas or the original apple, you might say. But instead, we've modified these foods in all kinds of different ways for hundreds of years, really. And so the term genetically modified or genetically modified organisms is maybe not the most helpful or accurate. But we'll continue to use those terms throughout our discussion here, simply because those are most widely recognized as being the terms that get used in this discussion. But really, genetically engineered, I think, is a more appropriate term. So Placius begins the chapter by introducing what's called the Green Revolution. Essentially, this sets the stage, which is a way of thinking about how, in the mid 20th century, scientists started developing new ways to increase crop yields. Things like synthetic fertilizers, chemical pesticides, irrigation systems were really important, as well as hybrid seeds that were designed to maximize productivity. And we saw this sort of discussion quite a bit in the most recent module last week, especially as it relates to the use of fertilizers. And how this kind of developed after World War II in a way that really kind of maximized our ability to produce crops, specifically the ability to produce corn. So on the one hand, the Green Revolution certainly is a clear sort of moral success, insofar as it does help us to prevent widespread famine, particularly in places like Asia or Latin America, where, for instance, it's estimated that American involvement in this regard is estimated to have saved over 1 billion lives through high yield wheat varieties, for instance, high yield corn, soy, these sorts of crops. And from this perspective, then, introducing different technologies that allow us to increase yield, that does seem like a moral good. It's a way in which we can use human intelligence and innovation to reduce suffering, to reduce famine or hunger or poverty, perhaps. But the Green Revolution also comes with a number of serious costs. For instance, it does seem to make farmers dependent upon very expensive inputs, things like fertilizers and irrigation systems that farmers are now largely dependent upon. And it also contributes to soil depletion and things like chemical pollution, a dramatic loss in biodiversity as different traditional crop varieties are replaced with, essentially very highly productive strains of different crops like corn and so forth. It also reinforces different global inequalities where wealthier farmers could afford the new technology, but poorer ones are unable to afford this kind of technology. So on the one hand, the Green Revolution is very helpful, but it does present, on the other hand, a kind of ethical dilemma where we're essentially stuck between two bad choices, sort of a kind of impossible choice, if you will. And this certainly haunts our contemporary modern agricultural system. We can think about this in terms of whether we should measure the moral value of food technology, purely in terms of its ability to feed a large number of people, or should we also consider its long-term environmental and social impacts? It looks like those two different goals are going to push us in different directions. And so that sets the stage for Plakius, right? That introduces this general kind of tension that we want to keep in mind as we turn to the different aspects of food technology, as well as the evolution of food itself. Right, so that then introduces the debate over GM foods, genetically modified foods, or as I said previously, genetically modified organisms, which essentially result in the kind of direct altering of an organism's genetic material. So notice that this is where we are actually inserting different genes from a different species in order to introduce a desired trait in particular crops, for instance. So take an example. One might use a gene that allows bacterium to resist pests and insert it into corn, producing corn that naturally repels insects without needing to be sprayed by pesticides. So you might think that different supporters of GMOs are just, kind of the next logical step in that kind of long history of agriculture, long human history, that is. After all, we've been very selective in breeding plants and animals for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps. So GMOs, you might think are just sort of the next logical step here. They're just one more very precise and efficient way to do what farmers have already been doing for a very long time. Yet at the same time, there may be critics who see this as a kind of really problematic process. They might argue that there's a fundamental difference that we need to pay attention to here, right? So instead of working with what seems like a very natural process of reproduction and selection, genetic engineering itself allows us to cross different species boundaries, and this then creates combinations that would never actually occur naturally in the natural process. So for these sort of critics, it's not simply just a technological innovation. Rather, there's moral aspects that are crucial to deciding to introduce this kind of technology. Moral issues that are important for how humans relate to nature itself. Right, so Plakius notes that the philosophical debate about GMOs essentially can be divided into two very broad categories. So on the one hand, Plakius argues, and I think she's right here, that there will be a set of objections that we can call extrinsic objections. These sorts of objections focus on the consequences of GMOs, where we're focusing primarily on the impact that these technologies are going to have on the environment, on human health, on society at large, right? So that's what we mean here by extrinsic objections. There's something wrong with introducing GMOs. That kind of technology is problematic for the consequences that it implies. On the other hand, there's another set of objections that we might call intrinsic objections. And these sort of objections claim that GMOs are morally wrong in and of themselves, right? There's something wrong with them, irrespective or independent of their effects or their consequences. Right. So what I want to do now is I want to go through some of these objections to make sure that you're understanding what exactly Plakius is getting at here. So let's turn first to the extrinsic objections. The first objection is this idea that GMOs are bad for the environment. There's something bad about GMOs insofar as they harm the environment, and that's one of the most common objections that we hear about GMOs. For instance, different crops that are engineered to resist pests or herbicides. These sorts of technologies can then often lead to the overuse of chemicals, the development of what we might call super weeds, and the contamination of non-genetically modified through things like pollen drift, for instance. I want to actually take a look at what she says, what Plakius says here on page 111, because I think it's important to pay attention to those. So at the top of page 111 here, Plakius says that in response to the argument that GMOs, that these crops can increase yields, which would allow us to feed the world using less land. She says that critics point out that we already have plenty of farmland, and we're just using it to grow food for animals, not for humans. And that seems right, right? We're not producing, with the use of these GMOs, all these, new technologies. We're not really producing more food for the purpose of reducing suffering. Rather, we're producing largely all of this food, primarily corn, to feed animals. And so, if we kind of think about this issue, this objection, in terms of whether or not we really need to rely upon so many animals in terms of factory farming, then we may not need to produce as much corn if we were not also producing so much meat from eating animals. In fact, she goes on to say here that the fact that proponents of GM type technology rarely mention these sort of alternatives is evidence, at least to proponents, that their primary concerns are neither humanitarian nor environmental, but actually their primary concern is profitability. Right. So it's the fact that we live in a capitalist society where the bottom line, the amount of money that we're able to make, that's what's motivating the use of these new technologies rather than feeding more people. So this idea then that GMOs are essentially bad for the environment, I think holds a lot of weight. With regard to the fact that this is going to kind of end up with a sort of an arms race, she says. It's an arms race between pesticides and plants themselves, where we're going to have to continuously produce more and more different new strands of corn, let's say, in order to combat the fact that many of these pests have become resistant to different pesticides. Right? So if we take that seriously, she says that this will in turn require even more stronger chemicals, which will in turn create further resistance and so on. This is a kind of arms race between pesticide manufacturers and plants. In other words, she says, the receipt that GMO crops offer is only temporary, right? It's only going to be a matter of time. And they will eventually, in fact, require even more pesticides and herbicides. Or, however, what would be even worse is that this will lead to the evolution of pests that can't be controlled. And of course, the increased use of herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers leads to more runoff entering into the water supply, increasing human exposure to pesticides, and so on and so forth. Right. So I think that she's making a really, really important point here that the more we do this, any benefit is only going to be temporary. The long-term problems it seems to cause for the environment is going to be much more profound. Yet at the same time, you might think that different proponents would argue that the reality is much more complicated. That some GM crops, maybe different strands of corn, let's say, that these actually reduce the need for chemical pesticides. There may be different strands of crops where it's in their own proteins that we're able to target specific pests without the more broad environmental damages that would be caused by spraying. So in this sense, then there may be different kinds of technologies, different genetically modified or genetically engineered strands of corn, let's say, that can sometimes be more environmentally friendly than any conventional agricultural system that we currently have. And so I think that leads to a more complicated, maybe a deeper philosophical question, which is simply, is the moral problem itself one that deals with technology, or is the problem more focused on human practice, right? Is it the large scale industrial farming that's really the problem, or is the problem in some sense corporate control or failure of regulations? Is that the problem? It's not immediately clear. And if the real moral problem is not really the technology itself, but rather the human practices that we're using to implement the technology, if that's what turns out to be morally problematic, then perhaps our ethical focus should not be on banning GMOs. Instead, maybe the ethical focus should be on to what extent we are using this technology responsibly and sustainably. So now I want to turn to the second objection, which is the idea that GMOs threaten biodiversity. Right, that's a second major problem. Is that the worry is that biotechnology companies promote a small number of genetically modified crops. Say, for instance, one kind of crop that might be pest resistant, some kind of corn or soybean, let's say. And then farmers around the world, if this is true, then it's likely that they will just simply stop planting local varieties, the local crops that grow in that part of the world. Then this leads to what's sometimes called monocultures, where what we end up having is a kind of genetic uniformity of crops, and that actually it presents an important threat to the entire food system, where it's going to be more vulnerable to things like disease or climate shifts or pest outbreaks. And I think that it's important to understand exactly how evolution works here. Evolution thrives on diversity. If we have a gene pool that's very sort of uniform, that is to say that there's not a lot of diversity within the gene population in that particular population, then when there is a threat, say some sort of a disease that is introduced into that population, then it might destroy the entire gene pool or most of it. So we actually need diversity in genes in order to be able to withstand these sorts of threats. If a disease enters into that population, it might destroy some of the genes, but not all of it. Right. So evolution thrives on diversity in that way. And when you have a monoculture with genetic uniformity in the particular crops that we are producing, then that does seem to make us very vulnerable to all sorts of different environmental threats, things like disease or climate shift and so forth. And we've actually seen this before, right? Take, for instance, the Irish potato famine. That's a great example where the particular famine itself was made far worse because farmers depended almost entirely on one specific variety of potatoes. Of course, on the other hand, supporters of different GMO technologies might actually respond by claiming that biotechnology could actually increase biodiversity. Since genetic modification allows us to develop all sorts of different crops that can survive in previously inhospitable environments, then that technology itself doesn't demand monoculture. Rather, it's the markets and the economic incentives that demand or push us into a kind of monoculture. And again, this isn't necessarily a problem with the technology per se. It looks like it's a problem with the way in which we're using the technology. What's motivating us? What are the incentives? And that's largely based on different governmental regulations and the capitalist sort of economy that is, in the background, the larger context as it relates to, what gives rise to these sorts of monocultures. And so that raises an important question. How do we balance things like efficiency and global food supply chains against ecological resilience and local autonomy, for instance? And then that introduces, I think, which is another really important objection. This is the third objection that Plakius goes through, which is that GMOs perpetuate all kinds of different social injustices. And again, this is an extrinsic objection because we're focusing on the kinds of social inequalities or social justices as it relates to this technology. So here, critics point out that GM technology often benefits very large corporations and wealthy farms and largely disadvantages smaller companies or smaller farms more specifically. So when we think about these different companies that have patents over their genetically modified seeds and how this specifically prohibits different farmers from saving and replanting them, and then also forcing them to buy new seeds each year, This creates an economic kind of dependency, and it shifts the power from farmers to corporations. So, in some developing countries, the adoption of GM crops has even led to debt crises among different farmers who can't you simply cannot afford the annual cost of seed and chemicals. Right. So I think you can see then how this creates a very important problem in terms of equity and social justice. Yet at the same time, supporters of GMOs might argue that these sorts of injustices are not caused by the technology. Rather, it's how the technology is being used. More specifically, how is the technology owned and how is it regulated? In principle, GMOs could be developed to be distributed in ways that promote justice. For example, by creating drought resistant crops for poor regions or simply making seed technology freely available to these people. So the objection, I think, forces us to confront this deeper issue about the ethics of technology itself. Is the moral issue really with the technology, or is it with the way the technology is being used, specifically in a free market capitalist society or economic system? And again, this introduces questions about who controls the innovation, who benefits from it. Is the moral problem really with the mere fact that we can genetically modify these crops, or is it the systems, the structures of ownership and profit that's governing the use? And then what about dependence itself? Why exactly is dependence a necessarily a bad thing? Just think about all the different ways in which we're dependent upon things in our current society, and think about whether you might take those dependencies to be good or bad. Say, for instance, our dependency on things like pharmaceutical companies or our dependency on hospitals. If you get ill, then you are dependent on these different technological advances. Is there a moral problem with the technology itself? Or is the problem with the systems and the structures in place that allocate these different technologies? Or think about the fact that we are dependent on things like automobiles for travel, right? I would not be able to get onto campus if I didn't own a car. If my car broke down, knock on wood or knock on something, if I was without a vehicle, then I would have to like Uber onto campus, and so I would still be dependent on an automobile, unless if I happen to live in a city where I could use mass transportation. But even that is still some form of transportation that I would be dependent on. Or thinking about things like airline companies. If you want to travel across the country or maybe overseas to Europe or somewhere else, well, then you will be dependent on those airlines and those particular companies. So it's just not immediately clear to what extent our dependency is necessarily a bad thing. All right, so now let's look at the fourth objection. Again, this objection is an extrinsic objection. It's the final one that we'll look at, and it's labeled here. Plakius calls it safety risk and the precautionary principle. So the basic idea here is that critics could argue that we don't actually know enough about the long-term effects of eating GMO foods or their long-term impact on ecosystems at large. Right? So once a modified gene enters into the environment, it can't easily be recalled. We can't just simply take it out. And so that seems to suggest that we should take what's called the precautionary principle, right? We should use this precautionary principle insofar as if an action might cause serious and irreversible harm, then we should really refrain from doing it. We should refrain from doing it if we lack full scientific certainty that it can be avoided. Now, of course, defenders of GMOs counter this particular version of the principle. And if you look at the text, the chapter, there's several different versions of the principle that we can think about. But they counter that this principle can lead to a kind of paralysis, a paralysis by caution, we might say. And indeed, all innovation carries all sorts of risks. And if we always wait for the complete certainty that we seem to be demanding here, then we might prevent all kinds of different technologies that could otherwise, save a lot of lives and improve sustainability in all kinds of different ways. So this again presents a kind of classic philosophical problem. Should morality be grounded in avoiding possible harms, or should we be thinking about morality in terms of pursuing possible benefits? And Plakius' discussion, I think, with regard to this final extrinsic objection, I think it does a nice job of helping us see that both having the right kind of caution and the right kind of innovation, both can actually be moral virtues that are pulling us in different directions, opposite directions. And so, which way you go, which side you end up on, you might largely depend upon your own values, what you find to be more important. All right, so now let's turn to a couple of intrinsic objections. Notice that these intrinsic objections, they claim there's something morally problematic with the technology itself, right? There's something morally wrong in and of itself. So that's what we're shifting to now. Those sorts of claims that say genetically modified foods is morally wrong, irrespective or independent of the consequences or effects that they might have. All right, so the first objection that we're going to look at claims that genetically modified foods is morally problematic because they're essentially unnatural. There's something unnatural about them. And I think it's a very common objection because many people do feel that inserting foreign genes into different plants or animals crosses a kind of moral boundary. It's like playing God or tampering with the natural order in some way. But I think Placius brings up a good point in response. It's not immediately clear what exactly we mean by natural here. What exactly are we trying to say? And notice that humans have been modifying nature for millennia. Every single domesticated animal and every cultivated crop is, in some sense, unnatural, insofar as we've shaped these crops through selective breeding and so on and so forth. And take, for instance, corn. Corn looks nothing like its wild ancestor. And so the corn that we have today is unnatural in some regard. I want to read what she says in regard to this particular objection because I think it's important to keep in mind what exactly are we trying to say by claiming that this sort of technology is unnatural. All right, so here's what she says on page 117. A variant of this objection is that GM crops are unnatural and therefore wrong. Now, this objection is really quite tricky to spell out because equating something that's natural with something that's good forces us to say that something pretty terrible, right? She goes on to say that it would force us to claim that rape or genocide or cancer or famine or death in childbirth, that all of these things are good. But surely we would reject any ethical view that led to the conclusion that these sorts of things, like child cancer, is good. So what is Placius trying to say here? Well, notice that each of these examples, rape, genocide, cancer, famine, death in childbirth, right? All of those things are natural, right? Insofar as they are naturally occurring things that happen in the world. And so the mere fact that something is natural, we can't automatically therefore say it's good, because then we would be saying things like rape, genocide, cancer, famine, and so forth, that these things are also good because they naturally occur in the world. So that seems absurd. So that should not be what we mean here. We should also probably be careful to not simply equate something that's technological with being unnatural. We have all sorts of different technological advancements, and it's not clear that those are playing God, right? When you get on an airplane in order to fly across seas, that's a technological advancement that's not really natural, but I don't know that we would say it's playing God. Or take, for instance, a fire department. A fire department provides us the technology to put out a burning building, maybe even a burning skyscraper. And so that kind of technology doesn't seem natural. It's not something that's naturally occurring in the environment. It's something that we created in order to do something good in the world. And so it's not clear that that's playing God. Although I will say there was a time when people thought in general that we should not have a fire department because it was kind of like playing God. If God wanted that house to be on fire, then we should let it burn to the ground. But I think most people would recognize as that to be kind of an absurd conclusion, right? So the fact that we have this technology to put out a burning building is not like playing God. And so what's different here with GMOs? Why are GMOs like playing God or unnatural in this regard? It's not immediately clear. So even if the moral argument against GMOs is simply that they're unnatural, then we need to, take some measure or effort to clarify whether unnatural means immoral or just something like human made. And Pelagius suggests that the term unnatural often hides much deeper moral concerns that I think, have something to do with like power and humility or respect for the integrity of life in general. Again, this raises a philosophical challenge that we need to confront. When we say that something's unnatural, are we expressing a genuine moral truth? Or are we simply expressing some sort of feeling of discomfort about, for instance, growing, a crop that has genetically been modified, or inserting genes into a living animal? This sort of discomfort about our growing control over nature itself. And that introduces the next objection, which again, this is an intrinsic objection that we can describe in terms of the yuck factor, right? This is the idea that genetically modified organisms produce a yuck factor in us, that we feel disgust. So it produces some feeling of disgust in us. And many people, I think, do react to genetically modified foods with this kind of feeling, with a kind of instinctive sense that there's something morally wrong or disturbing, even if I can't quite articulate what that might be. And so some philosophers have argued that this kind of moral disgust can be actually quite meaningful and quite helpful. Some might argue that this is a sort of wisdom of repugnance, that when we feel this sort of disgust, that we should pay attention to it. The idea that this feeling of disgust actually reveals some deeper intuitive boundaries that we should take note of, boundaries that might help warn us when we're doing something that's morally wrong or that violates some sort of human dignity, or some aspect of the natural order of things. Still others, for instance, Placius, take a much more skeptical approach, where disgust, Placius points out, is oftentimes culturally conditioned in us. It's not something that is inherent in us, but it's something that we're sort of taught to feel. So one society might find something to be quite disgusting, while another society might find it to be normal or even sacred. For example, people in one culture might recoil from eating insects or raw fish. I am one that thinks that that's disgusting, right? So I would be a part of that culture. Others might see eating insects or raw fish or other sorts of things like a liver or cow testicles, all sorts of other things that might be disgusting in one culture, but in another culture, these things might be perfectly fine, perfectly natural forms of food, and maybe even just everyday staples. So we need to ask, can discuss actually be a reliable guide to what's morally permissible and what's morally wrong? Or is it the case that something like disgust, the yuck factor, simply reflects our social norms and our social prejudices? Indeed, Plakies connects this notion of disgust to a very practical ethical question regarding labeling. So, for instance, even if disgust isn't always rational, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be allowed to act on it. Maybe we should think of GM foods as needing some sort of a label so that consumers can choose whether to eat them, even if their reasons are emotional rather than scientific. So someone who supports this kind of requirement of labeling GMO food, they might actually argue that consumers' autonomy actually demands transparency in this regard. Right? People should have the right to know what they are eating, whether for health reasons, for moral reasons, or aesthetic reasons, or simply because they might feel disgust with regard to these sorts of foods. Still, opponents will argue that labeling GMO foods actually implies that they are dangerous, or they might reinforce some sort of public fear rather than promoting an actual informed choice. So here again, we've got a philosophical question that arises. Do you have a right to know every single thing about your food, even when our reasons for carrying that might not be fully rational? Should you have a right to know whether your food is genetically modified in order to invoke a kind of disgust or ick factor? That's not immediately clear. And so finally, I think Plakius does a nice job of pointing out that there does seem to be a kind of irreconcilable moral disagreement that's at work here. Placius closes this chapter by asking whether this debate is maybe a better reflection of how people on different sides of the issue are not just simply debating facts. Rather, it seems that these folks hold fundamentally different moral views and perhaps worldviews in general, right? So for some, technology represents human progress. It's a way to use reason and creativity to overcome the different natural limits that we experience in life. And for others, technology represents a kind of overreach, overstepping what we ought to do. It's a kind of failure to respect the natural world and the moral boundaries that comes with the natural world. And so this kind of disagreement may never actually be resolved, at least not through mere evidence or mere data, certainly not through logic alone. Because it's ultimately about, our own values, what it means to live a good life, to live a meaningful life, to live a responsible human life, and to flourish, and so on and so forth. So, as you're working through the material for this module, I want you to think about the following questions. The first question is simply, when we call something that's technology unnatural, what do we actually mean by that? Are we making some sort of a moral claim, or are we simply expressing some sort of unease or discomfort with it? Second question is, can feelings of disgust ever actually provide us with moral insight? Or are they better understood as obstacles to good ethical reasoning? The third question is, if GMO technology could ever eliminate hunger, would that make its risks or its social costs morally acceptable, right? Would the benefits outweigh the problems? And then finally, I want you to think about whether you think the disagreement that exists in our world over genetically modified foods, whether you think this is something that can ever be resolved, or do you think it is rooted in some more fundamental part of how we're approaching this issue, some fundamentally different ways of seeing the world itself. So those are the things that I want you to consider as you're working through this material.